Hi Year 9. We're going to carry on with the wife in London today, but today we're going to be analysing it because that's where we're up to, and we're only going to be doing half the poem today to spread it out quite nicely for you. So just to recap, we've revised the context. We did that in lesson 1 on Monday, and we've looked at the writer's purpose, Hardy's purpose, and we've also analysed the title. We did all of that on Monday, and you've done the quiz on that, and most of you have done really well, so well done. We've made sure on Tuesday's lesson 2, that we understood the writer's meanings, and you should have just done a quiz on that today. And then, so our next step now is to analyse, pick apart the writer's choices. So we're going to have a look at what decisions Hardy's made and to what effect. And we're going to try and link in context as much as we can and the writer's purpose. So the 3 elements that we're going to look at are just simply his word choices. So what has actually Hardy chosen to include, and what words has he used to do that? That in itself is analysing the writer's choices. And then a little bit trickier, we're going to look at some structural choices he's made and some poetic techniques that he's chosen to include in his poem. So try and approach when you're analysing poems from that perspective. Step back and think, well, what choices has the writer made and what impact have they had on this poem? And if you do that, and if you write your essays in that way, you can't really go wrong. Okay, so just before we launch into stanza 1, I just wanted to go over some key poetic techniques that you're going to come across today, just to make sure that you've got the definition clear before we launch in. Can you please write as a title in your book or on paper if you've finished? Sorry, and I didn't stress really last time. This can be done in Miss Hughes's book. It can be done with your other poetry work. It doesn't need to be in your language book. It is literature work, really. Well, it is literature work. So ideally, you'd do it in your purple book, is it, that you've got with Miss Hughes? Don't worry if you haven't done that this week so far. It doesn't matter. Just make sure you keep everything together on A Wife in London, and we'll sort it out in September. Okay, so once you've worked out which book you're doing it in, if you write the title, Analysing A Wife in London, and then a subheading, Key Poetic Techniques. Pause the video to get yourself ready. Okay, so the first technique that we're going to look at in this poem is a motif, which is basically an image or an object that's referred to frequently across the text, something that keeps coming up in the poem, or it could be across a whole novel. So motif is how we say that. And in this poem, there's a motif of coldness. So we're going to look at that today across stanzas 1 and 2. Foreshadowing, I think that you'll be familiar with this one, is when a writer hints at a future event or mood. That's going to come up today. And also narrative structure, and I don't think you'll sort of think of this as a technique, but it absolutely is. Hopefully you can see that Hardy structured this poem like a story. It's got different chapters, hasn't it, with the different chapter titles, the tragedy, the irony, and he's even numbered them like a novel would. So through this, we can say that he emphasises that every water widow has a tragic story. It also reflects his own profession. He was a novelist and is kind of drawing on those features in his poem. But the key thing, I think, is it's better to link it to meaning than it is to the writer himself. And I think the meaning conveyed by this narrative structure is this idea that this woman has a story that is worth telling. And even though we usually focus on the soldiers fighting in the war, and that's what war is about, he's highlighting here, no, this woman has a story as well. All these women have a story as well. These people at home also matter, which links really nice, doesn't it, to his purpose and his context. So if you can jot that down. I've probably expressed it better speaking to you than I have written down, so try and write down what I've said to you as well as what I've written there. Okay, pause now if you need to any more time on that. Right, so let's launch into stanza 1 then. If you've got a copy of the poem and you've managed to print it, then you obviously can just make these notes on the paper copy of the poem. If you've got an electronic copy, you might want to spend some time adding the annotations onto Microsoft Word if you want to. Alternatively, what I've done is I've just labelled each annotation with the line number, so you can just write in your book the line number and the analysis, and then you'll be able to include that in your transfer it into your anthology in September. So it's up to you which way you want, how you want to do it. Okay, so today is very much I'm going to teach you the analysis of the poem, and the next lesson I'm going to ask you some questions to test your understanding of that through a quiz, but also I'm going to prompt you to do that in the PowerPoint as well, just to make sure that you've understood everything. All right, so the tragedy. So stanza 1 is the one where the wife is sat alone in cold London. So just going to try and kind of give you summaries of each stanza to help remind you what's going on in each one. I'm totally nicking how they name Friends episodes if anyone is a fan of Friends. All right, so let's get started. So line 1, we've got she sits in the tawny vapor. So if we zoom in first of all to Hardy's choice of that word sits, it's a very passive verb, isn't it, to just sit. I've been doing a lot of sitting recently, too much sitting. So it's as though she can't move forward in her life while her husband is at war. She's just sat in this vapor. Yeah, she's very passive. She's not got control because war's taken her future away from her. So it's a very sort of negative, glum opening to the poem that he wants to highlight, or he's chosen to. The next part of the line is also important. So we've got in the tawny vapor, and that word in suggests that she's surrounded by it, doesn't it? She's not looking at the tawny vapor. She is within it. It's everywhere around her. Now, remember that the vapor can be the misery of war, which is polluting the streets of London. Literally, obviously, there would have been pollution as well. Or it can be, remember, her own misery. Do you remember it can mean a state of depression? So it's as though there's two meanings here, and you would need to analyse both meanings to get yourself the really high marks, and this is a really nice way to do that. So the vapor possibly could be the misery of war that's descended on the city and surrounded everybody, not just her, but it's also her own misery and she can't get out of it. And if you think about how it feels when you are in that low state of mind, that you feel like you are surrounded by it and you can't get out of it, and there's nothing else you can see as there other than that really low feeling and that depression that's sitting on your chest. So he really well conveys all of that through just the line in the tawny vapor. So it's an amazing line, and a really powerful line to open his poem with. And with overall then we've got this feeling that Hardy's suggesting that war is debilitating. It stops us in our tracks. It prevents us from growing and moving. She's sitting there, she's stuck in something, and therefore straight away from the first line, this is very anti-war, isn't it? It's very focused on the negative sides of war. Okay, that's line 1. Line 4 then, skipping to line 4, we've got like a waning taper. Now if you remember, that is the image of a taper was a candle, and waning is the idea that it's dying out. The light is going to slowly stop and fade away, as candles do when they get to the end of their life. So in line 4, he's using this image of the dying candle, and it can symbolise the woman's hope and happiness that is dying out because of the war. But it can also foreshadow, and remember we mean hint at, her husband's death. Her husband's death is a waning taper, as is all the men who went away to fight in war. Their lives are waning tapers, aren't they? So again, a very sort of bleak image to start off his poem with, and sort of really emphasising the widespread effects of war, not just on the people but also the environment, and think that does happen. So the example that comes to mind, this was definitely before your time, is when Princess Diana died, and I was working at the BBC doing work experience at the time, like a few years later, and somebody said to me that she was in London the day after Princess Diana had died, and when she was walking around the streets of London, there was just a real quiet, strange feeling that nobody was happy, nobody was smiling. It was as though the whole city was mourning, even the buildings and the streets. And she described it really beautifully like that. And I think that that's what he's getting at here, that this grief that comes from losing so many men to war, and the misery of waiting to find out at home, and how debilitating that is, can actually cover a whole city and make it feel like a really dark, place where the light is fading from it and there's no hope or joy anymore. So hopefully I'm cheering you up on this lovely day. And then just to finish off stanza 1, the one where the wife is sat alone in cold London, we're going to have a look at line 5. So Hardy uses the image of the street lamp here, doesn't he? And obviously we've got that first explicit mention of the motif of coldness. But really this whole stanza is a very cold, bleak stanza, isn't it? So we've got the sense that London is lonely and isolating. There's no warmth coming off this street lamp. The street lamps are supposed to offer protection, aren't they, and warmth and safety, and that's not what these are doing. They're just glimmering coldly. So it suggests she's got little support or warmth in her life without a husband, and this is what war does. It just makes people cold inside. So he highlights what life was like in the Boer War for those who are left behind. Just try and frequently in your analysis make references to the specific war, what Hardy's suggesting about the war, because that's how you'll get context marks, and it really is that straightforward. You don't need to be going into loads of detail about how many men went to fight or what year it was or anything like that. Okay, so pause here if you want some more digestion time on stanza 1, because there's quite a lot there, even though I've only analysed 3 lines. And I would just like to stress as well that there are things you could analyse and pick apart in lines 2 and 3, absolutely. And if you really want to challenge yourself, you could do that now. The only reason is that I've picked these 3 lines is because I think that they're the most important, and you only have to write about these poems for 20 minutes in your exam. There's a lot you need to remember, and I don't want to overload you by analysing too much. So please do feel free to analyse the other lines if you want to. And also please don't feel like I'm selling you short. It's better to know a lot about say 6 or 7 quotations across a poem than it is to know a million things about every single line. It won't work as well for your essays. Okay, let's move on to stanza 2 then. So stanza 2 is the one where the wife gets the news that her husband has died. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is line 6. Now, in line 6, we've got this wonderful word cracks. So a messenger's knock cracks smartly. Now, again, there's more you can analyse here. You can look at the way it says a messenger instead of the messenger, which suggests she's detached. You can add that down if you want to. I'm going to stop trying to get carried away. There's enough I've already written down. So the knock cracks smartly. Now, I think the word cracks is the most interesting choice by Hardy here. It really symbolises the harshness of this knock, doesn't it? So the sounds k and ck are cacophonic, and that's just a posh word for saying that they sound harsh. You might have come across these in Dulce in the first stanza where we've got trudge and sludge. That udge sound is very harsh. And back and hags. Lots and lots of harsh sounds at the start of Dulce to just kind of represent that, the harshness of war. Well, we've got that again here with cracks. So I feel, as well as representing the harshness of the news and the way it's delivered, so Hardy's criticising that really, he also is representing the idea that the news is going to break her. The news will crack her open, won't it? It will break her heart. It'll break her future apart. So we've got a really like 3 things there sort of surmised by this one word cracks, which is these beautiful words that Hardy's created that we want you to be able to analyse and pick apart. I also think smartly is interesting because I think it smartly literally highlights that it's a very quick knock, but it really suggests that it's professional and brief, doesn't it? There's no warmth here. So we've got again the motif of coldness coming through, that this man, a random messenger, is going to knock on this door and deliver this news as quickly as he can. And I don't know, compare it to a doctor who's going to come out of a delivery room and say, not a delivery room, like an operation room, and say whether things have gone right or wrong. Doctors are trained, aren't they, to do that in a really kind of emotional way. This is the complete opposite. Okay, so we really do get the sense that there's an element of criticising the military's methods here of how the news is delivered. And then he builds on this really well with flash news. So I'm linking the quotations together, which is called cross-referencing, if you weren't sure. So I'm joining those two quotations together, from cracks smartly to flash news. Because again, there's this sense that it's over very quickly and there's no compassion. So those quotations link very nicely. Okay, so that's lines 6 and 7. Pause here if you want some more time. Right, to finish off then, line 9. So I'm skipping line 8, which obviously just tells us that she's confused, which is a lot of people's initial reactions, isn't it? When we get bad news, it confuses us, it dazes us. So line 9, those shaped so shortly. So Hardy is highlighting here how the biggest news that you could ever receive at that time during a war was actually delivered in the shortest form of a telegram. Now, you can get that in because it shows contextual understanding and it'll help you get marks. So again, there's just really the sense that he's criticising the army's methods here, and that, you know, there's an element of irony in it as well, isn't there? That this is so big and so important, and yet it was shaped so shortly. You could also say, I'm just thinking off cuff, that, you know, that's symbolises the man's life and all soldiers' lives, that they are shaped so shortly because they're so at risk, aren't they, when they go off to war. That's actually a really nice point. You should add that on. Okay, line 10. He has fallen in the far south land. So obviously this is a really key line. So firstly, we've got the euphemism has fallen. So remember, a euphemism is a word which is a softer word or an easier word to kind of hear than a harsh reality word. So rather than saying has died, it has fallen. Obviously, to imagine someone falling is a nicer image than someone dying. So that's why it's a euphemism. It's easier to comprehend. So the military use that quite a lot. So he's mimicking the language used by the military there, but it's also really highlighting the wife's inability to understand. So I've embedded a quotation there. I'm referring back to line 8 and that word understand. You know, if she's can't comprehend what she's reading, then that phrase has fallen really emphasizes that. Like, sure, you know, the first stage of grief is denial, isn't it? So yeah, it's sorry, just in case you don't know, it's denial, then anger, bargaining, which is where you say if only, and then depression, and then acceptance. So here we've got, you know, almost like a denial to not want to say the words has died, and the dashes almost highlight the hesitancy in the wife, that she doesn't want to read it. She must know what's in that letter. She must know what's in that telegram. You know, you could tell by the man walking. The messenger would probably be in military uniform. She would know what's coming. But it also highlights the importance of the news as well. Sorry, I should have deleted that word both there. You know, it stands out, doesn't it, on the page because it's so important. This is the key piece of news. Okay. So last thing to say about line 10. This vague language, far south land, we know that it's South Africa that he's referring to because we know our context. So I feel like, why didn't he just say in South Africa, or why did he not say in the Boer War? He's decided to use this phrase, far south land, to emphasize how remote this all feels. Like, it just must feel so distant. In 1899, how many people would have actually left England to go to South Africa? She probably can't even visualize the land that her husband has died in. So it really must feel like it's taking place in another world, like a really far away place. And I think he captures that perfectly by that phrase, far south land. It must have just felt completely remote, like even harder to understand, because you know, she's not going to get to see his body, she's not going to have a proper funeral, and it must just feel like a whole other world. That Southland, that's all she knows about it, it's South. Okay. Last thing I wanted to say was just about structure, and I just think this is an interesting verse or stanza for structure, especially with the indents in line 7 and 8. Can you see how line 7 and 8 start a little bit further over? And I think that really visually conveys the impact of the news. You know, it knocks her off kilter. It's a really beautiful way of visually demonstrating that. So you can see all the way through that Hardy's choices are to really highlight how miserable and awful the impact of war is, and how awful grief and loss is. Every single thing he's decided to do, everything we've talked about, you can see that's a common theme, isn't it? It's a common idea, everything we've said, everything we've analysed, and you can bring that together to create a really nice overview of what his purpose was and why he's made all these little decisions. The other thing I haven't written down is about him delaying the reader as well, in a way. Now we can see where this is going, because the title is the tragedy. The chapter title of this section is the tragedy, which in itself is foreshadowing, isn't it? We know that she's going to get bad news. But if you just have a look at how he delays that further in this stanza, he leaves it to the very last line of line 10 of this chapter of the poem to actually pin down that he's fallen, that he's gone. So we've got again this sense of narrative structure, that he's creating a climax at the end, almost like a cliffhanger with the ellipsis, the dot 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 at the end. So all together, he's really cleverly structured it, hasn't he, to sort of keep us waiting for that final confirmation right at the end. Again, to emphasize the tragedy. That's what he wants us to do. He wants to really emphasize what loss is and what it means on this very sort of individual level through one wife. But of course, she symbolizes plenty of wives across London at the time, and mothers and children. Okay. So again, pause there if you're not sure. I hope I've made the right decision in splitting this over 2 lessons. I didn't want to overwhelm you with the other 2 verses now. But please revisit any quotations, and if there's anything you're not sure about, just send me a message and I'll help you out. And we'll have a quiz on this next lesson. Okay. In the meantime, I hope that you have a lovely weekend, and take care. Bye, guys.